Otherwise, I have no German vocabulary, so I'll speak in English. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It was an invitation to FAO's Assistant Director General, Alexander Mueller, who was unable to come, and he sent me to talk about sustainable diets, but he sends his best regards to everyone. I have slides. The title of the presentation is Our Challenge, Life or Food for Everyone. And we have problems that everyone knows about. We have nearly 1 billion people who are hungry. We have 2 billion people with micronutrient malnutrition. We have another 2 billion people who are overweight or obese. And that micronutrient malnutrition problem covers both the hungry, the underweight, and the overweight and obese. So diets are not sustainable. Environments are not sustainable. We have ecosystems that are degraded, some permanently. We have biodiversity loss, some permanent. So environments are not sustainable. Agriculture, as it is practiced today, is also not sustainable. We have monoculture agriculture, intensive livestock industries, intensive other industries that are too intensive. We have overuse of agricultural chemicals, and we have extensive food losses and waste. So FAO has been looking at these issues, and with several different initiatives, including a workshop on sustainable diets and biodiversity, and a scientific symposium, and a survey, an international survey, we came to understand that even in the mainstream nutrition community, there are many concerns about agriculture, and the results of this survey, I won't go into the details of it, indicate that nutritionists in the world, whether they're clinical nutritionists or in the food sector, believe that you cannot solve the problems of malnutrition with a single sector. It needs to include agriculture, it needs to include health, and it needs to include the environment sector. And one of the results of these three activities was a consensus definition for sustainable diets. That definition is as follows. Sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They are culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable. They are nutritionally adequate and healthy while optimizing both natural and human resources. This definition came about as we were preparing for Rio +20 and a consolidated response from the Rome-based agencies, the Rome-based food agencies, to present at Rio +20. At the same time, out of Rio +20 came the Zero Hunger Challenge issued by the UN's Secretary General, and it is completely consistent with many of the things that we've heard here today. Access to adequate food for all year round, reducing the number of stunted children. Food systems are sustainable. A growth in smallholder productivity and income, and food losses and waste need to be brought under control. We have had some successes, in spite of the fact that the problems of malnutrition are still too high. We have seen stunting decrease in many parts of the world. We've seen it decrease in Africa. We've seen it decrease also in Asia. Sorry, it's hard for me to see this little screen. And it was more or less stable. I think that's Latin America. Sorry. No, that's Africa. So Africa, we haven't seen much in the way of decreasing in the problem of stunting. Stunting is an anthropometric measure, height for age. But at the same time, as we've seen some progress, including a slight decrease in the FAO's number of hungry people in the world, we have the problem of overweight and obesity, and that prevalence is going up. In Latin America, it started at a very high point in 1990, and it remains high, but it's gone up in Africa and Asia. And the problem of micronutrient malnutrition is persistent. We see it everywhere. Among the ways to address these problems in nutrition is looking at sustainable diets. The most famous of these so-called sustainable diets would be the Mediterranean diet. This is the new Mediterranean diet pyramid. I'd like to go into more detail on this, but in the interest of time, I would like to point out just one aspect of this, because it leads me to the next. I think I'm pointing to the word frugality up there. And frugality is a feature of the Mediterranean diet, and it's a feature of diets, traditional food systems all around the world. And this takes into consideration the amount of food eaten, the amount of food wasted. And we've heard several speakers already talk about food losses and waste. This is from a study published by FAO, and it shows the partitioning of food losses and waste from production to post-harvest and to what has been called consumption. What consumption means in this case is not food eaten, but food available to be eaten but not eaten. And that kind of food waste represents waste per se, but it also represents, when food is wasted, for example, in the UK, it represents a waste of natural resources in other parts of the world where food is produced. So the UK being not self-sufficient for, let's say, wheat, and wasting a high percentage of its bread and cereal products, it is representing a waste in natural resources in other parts of the world, water in particular. Another component of waste that hasn't been addressed is food waste in the form of food eaten above requirements. This we see for protein. We see people in developed countries eating protein well above the requirement for protein, and we certainly see it for energy. Obesity problem in the world is an energy problem. Too much energy is being consumed. So without going into detail into the algorithms and the assumptions, this is some of the data that we've calculated on food wasted and represented in the form of obesity. So for example, in North America and Oceania, this form of food waste, calculated as the energy content of the annual cereal supply, represents another, say, can't really read that, but 11, thank you, another 11%. And if we add that to the already calculated food losses and waste for North America and Oceania, it comes up to nearly 40% of the expressed as energy of an annual cereal production of the countries in those areas. And it's not just developed countries, it's also developing countries. And this is just some of the data from Egypt, where a developing country where obesity exceeds the problem of underweight and hunger in the population. And you can see these numbers are extremely high. And it's not just Egypt, it's many developing countries. In the interest of time, I'll skip that one. We've had many delegations in many fora saying a lot of things about the importance of food systems, a food systems approach, which we've heard the Club of Rome emphasizing. We know that dietary energy supply can be satisfied without diversity. But micronutrient supply cannot be satisfied without diversity. And going back even to, excuse me again, 1998, a delegate from Zambia at the COP, the governing body of the Convention on Biological Diversity, said, agricultural biodiversity is a matter of life and death for us. We cannot separate agrobiodiversity from food security, and yet we've separated them. We need to put them back together. The nutrient content differences at the level of the variety within a species can be greater than the nutrient content differences among different species. And this is just some examples for rice, where we see huge differences in the protein content based on the genetic resource. So some varieties, there are varieties with protein content as low as 5.5 grams per 100 grams, and varieties with nearly 15 grams per 100 grams. We don't capture this when we look at breeding programs necessarily, or recommending foods for through agricultural extension, for example. We need to consider nutrient content, not just for the sake of improving nutrition, but also to spare the agrobiodiversity. We know, for example, that in, let's say, Taiwan, there used to be more than 1,000 varieties, distinctive varieties of rice. We can find 50 now, yet, does that say 82? 82% of all the area cultivated under rice is cultivated in 3 varieties. So there's a huge amount of biodiversity loss. I'll point out just a couple of things here. The International Rice Commission recommended that the existing biodiversity of rice varieties and their nutrient composition be examined before engaging in breeding, or as a part of a breeding program. They also recommended that, that member countries should promote the sustainable development of aquatic biodiversity, because much of the micronutrient supply for rural populations comes not from the major crop that they grow, but from the other material in that ecosystem. And in this case, of a rice-based aquatic ecosystem, it comes from the other aquatic animals. And for example, in this rice-based aquatic ecosystem, in these 3 countries, you can see some examples of the other aquatic species that contribute the high-quality protein and the micronutrients to the diets of people who rely almost exclusively otherwise on rice. I won't go into detail on these, but go straight to this. And when we do interventions in countries, Mongolia, for example, is an interesting study. Mongolia, somewhere in there, oh, there it is chronically food insecure. And when we look at how to develop interventions to improve the food security, we think of livestock and maybe improving production. But when we look at the wider picture, bring nutrition in, and what are some of the considerations? Well, we wonder, Mongolia being a landlocked country, where do the people get their omega-3 fatty acids? Typically, you would get that from seafood. And we know that every adult needs about 2 grams per day of omega-3 fatty acids. Well, they get it from the mare's milk, a local breed. It's a genetic trait in combination with the biodiversity of the grasslands where they feed small mint family plants. And this combination, this ecosystem, this animal breed is how the population in Mongolia gets their omega-3 fatty acids. You change one thing in this picture, and the result would be that the population would need to get their omega-3 fatty acids from supplements. This is an unfinished story, and we're still looking at this. It has no vitamin A. This banana, some of these bananas have more than 8,000 micrograms per 100 grams of, let's call it, vitamin A. In Micronesia, where they have frank vitamin A deficiencies and children go blind, these bananas grow. They were part of their tradition, but now they drop to the ground and spoil. Or they did until a scientist there decided there might be something interesting in these local bananas, and she analyzed the provitamin A carotenoid content and discovered this. Now, the population of Micronesia is able to get their vitamin A intake, meet their requirement through local crops and not through supplements issued by UNICEF or their local doctor. I wanted to remind the audience of an FAO regional conference for Europe that took place a couple of years ago. It was the promotion of traditional regional agriculture and food products. The conference highlighted things like the Mediterranean diet as important for the Mediterranean, but also important to be used as a model for testing methods and indicators on sustainable diets. But more importantly, they remarked, oops, that's my time. They remarked that the goal of, I better read it down here, of increased global food production, including biofuel, should be balanced against the need to protect biodiversity, ecosystems, traditional food, and traditional agricultural practices. There are challenges, though. This was Europe. Would this be useful in other parts of the world? And it was thought, no, it won't be useful because food security in the least developed countries is a much greater concern, as is livelihoods, much less so in developed countries. Developed countries can afford to be concerned about food safety and biodiversity. And we believed this until we held an Afro-Foods meeting a couple of years ago. And the Africans themselves, in the call for action from the door of return, this is actually the door of no return from the House of the Slaves on Goree Island. They transformed it into the door of return for a food renaissance in Africa. And they noted that degradation of ecosystems and the loss of food biodiversity is contributing greatly to the increases in poverty and malnutrition in Africa. They recognize that returning to local crops and traditional food systems is a prerequisite for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity for food and nutrition. And they acknowledge that local foods are the basis for African sustainable diets. And I'll just end with this slide to point out that FAO, together with WHO and other partners, in November 2013 is holding the International Conference of Nutrition 21 years later, and we hope that delegates in this room are participants in that important international conference. Thank you.